Michael Thompson, 28, hadn't been back to his childhood home since his sister's funeral. The white two-story house in suburban Ohio stood as an unwelcome reminder of everything he'd lost. As he stepped inside, the creak of the front door echoed through the emptiness, and the stale air wrapped around him like a smothering blanket. The walls seemed to absorb the sounds of his footsteps, making each movement unnervingly silent. He paused in the hallway, his eyes catching on family photos. His mother had kept them all on display, unchanging. There was Emily, smiling in her high school uniform, her eyes bright with excitement. That smile haunted him. It was the same smile that filled his dreams, now marred by the memory of finding her lifeless in her bedroom. He shut his eyes, pushing back the swell of grief. It had been 3 months since Emily's death, and despite the police ruling it as an accident, a tragic fall down the stairs, Michael knew deep down that something had been off. Emily had been terrified in those last few weeks, her eyes darting around as if she expected someone to lunge out of the shadows. But she never told him what haunted her, and now it was too late. He headed up the narrow staircase, every creak of the old wooden steps bringing him closer to her room. The attic was his destination today, a place where Emily had often sought solitude. It was cluttered with old Christmas decorations, boxes of forgotten clothes, and remnants of childhood. Among the cobwebs in the dusty boxes, something caught his eye. A small, worn book half buried under a pile of old blankets. He pulled it free, frowning at the soft, aged leather cover, bound neatly with a red ribbon. Michael's fingers trembled slightly as he untied the ribbon, revealing the diary. The first page was unmistakably Emily's handwriting, her loopy cursive and little hearts over the eyes. Seeing her words brought a wave of pain, but also a strange sense of connection, as if she was right there, reaching out to him from beyond. There was nothing obviously sinister about it, yet he felt an inexplicable chill, as if opening it might unlock something far more troubling than he imagined. The attic seemed to grow colder as he turned the page. Michael carefully descended from the attic, the diary clutched tightly in his hand. He decided to take it to the kitchen, a place where sunlight filtered through the window, maybe hoping the warmth of daylight would make this feel less daunting. He sat at the wooden table, its surface scarred with years of family dinners, homework, and laughter. As he traced his fingers over the diary, he couldn't help but think of all the moments he and Emily had shared at this very table. Growing up, Michael had always been Emily's protector. She was the younger sibling by 12 years, a surprise addition to the family when their parents, Karen and Robert, were already moving past their expectations of having more children. Michael had practically raised her in some ways. He taught her how to ride a bike, helped with her math homework, and even sneaked her out for late-night fast food when she had a rough day. Their bond was unshakable, and he'd always been the one to shield her from whatever trouble came her way. But over the last year, Emily had begun to drift. She'd grown more distant, her once bright demeanor clouded by something Michael couldn't understand. She started spending more time alone, disappearing into the woods behind their house at odd hours. When he asked about it, she'd just give vague answers, something about needing time to think. Then there were the late-night phone calls, the hushed conversations that stopped abruptly whenever he entered the room. And the fear. He'd see it flash across her face in unguarded moments, like when a branch scraped against the window, or when the doorbell rang unexpectedly. The Thompson family had always been close-knit, but after Emily's death, everything changed. His mother, Karen, barely spoke, drifting like a ghost through the house. She spent her days in Emily's room, sitting silently among her daughter's belongings. His father, Robert, who had always been a pillar of strength, was now absent in another way, losing himself in work, staying out late, anything to avoid facing the emptiness at home. Michael opened the diary again, flipping through the early pages. The entries were mundane at first, notes about school, friends, small crushes. Emily's familiar voice echoed through her words, full of the innocence she had always carried. But as he continued, he began to notice a shift. The handwriting grew more erratic, the sentences shorter and disjointed. February 3rd, something's wrong. I feel it again. That cold feeling like I'm not alone. I told Mom, but she said I'm imagining things. She thinks I'm being dramatic. But I know it's real. February 10th, I saw it again outside near the woods. A figure just standing there, watching. I don't know what it wants. I don't know if it's even real. I'm scared. Michael felt a shiver run down his spine. He could remember that time. Emily had seemed paranoid, yes, but he chalked it up to the stresses of being a teenager. School, friends, whatever pressures she wasn't sharing. But reading these entries now, her fear felt raw and urgent, the scribbled words a plea that he hadn't understood back then. He turned the page, and a folded piece of paper slipped out, fluttering to the floor. Michael picked it up, carefully unfolding it. It was a crude drawing, stick figures representing their family, but there was something else. A shadowy figure loomed behind them, faceless and scribbled in thick, dark pencil. Emily's note at the bottom was brief but chilling. It's getting closer. He put the paper down, his heart pounding in his ears. The diary had been hidden away, tucked out of sight, as if Emily was trying to keep its contents secret. She must have known something terrible was coming, something she didn't feel safe enough to share even with him. The sense of lingering grief in the house grew heavier. Michael looked around the kitchen, the same worn-out appliances, the curtains Emily had picked out last summer, now dusty and closed. He realized he wasn't just looking for answers. He was chasing a way to fix something that felt utterly broken. Emily had been scared, and he had missed it, let it slip through his fingers. He owed it to her to find out what had happened. The ticking of the clock on the wall felt louder in the silence. Each second a reminder that time had passed, that he hadn't been there when she needed him most. As Michael continued reading, he felt an unsettling mix of sorrow and dread, a growing certainty that what he would find within those pages wasn't just the confusion of a frightened teenager, but something far more sinister, something that may not have ended with Emily. Michael leaned back in his chair, staring at the next page of Emily's diary. The more he read, the more he was beginning to understand that her fear wasn't just teenage anxiety. There was something deeper, something real and terrifying. He spent the following days in a strange routine, waking up, avoiding his mother's vacant stare, and then retreating to his room to read more. The diary had become his world. The initial entries were relatively normal, talks about her friends, school dances, and petty dramas. But soon, Emily's cheerful accounts of her days grew darker, replaced by a frantic urgency that made the pages tremble in his hands. She wrote about late-night sightings, the figure in the woods, the sensation of being watched even when she was in her own bedroom. There were pages where she described waking up at night, feeling an oppressive weight on her chest, unable to move or scream, a dark shape standing just out of focus at the edge of her bed. March 1st. It knows I see it. I swear it's closer now. Last night I heard it whispering. It knows my name. Michael felt his pulse quicken as he read those words. He remembered how, in the weeks before her death, Emily had started insisting that she didn't want to be alone at night. She'd sneak into his room, claiming nightmares had kept her awake. He had always thought it was just a phase, the irrational fears of a young girl. Now he was realizing how real those fears had been. The more he read, the more he became convinced that something had haunted his sister. Something that had gradually broken her spirit until, in the end, it claimed her life. It was like watching a horror film in slow motion, knowing the end but unable to change anything. The diary revealed something else that Michael hadn't expected. A series of entries mentioned a secret spot, a clearing in the woods where Emily had often gone. She described it as a place she'd been drawn to, despite her fear. She wrote about finding strange symbols carved into trees, about how sometimes she'd hear faint chanting when she was there, even though she saw no one around. March 12th. I shouldn't have gone back there. I saw them. I don't know what they are. They look almost human, but something is wrong. They knew I was watching. Michael read that line over and over. It was clear Emily had discovered something she shouldn't have. He felt a gnawing curiosity mingled with dread. What had she found in those woods? And more importantly, what had found her? Days passed in a blur as Michael became obsessed. The diary consumed him, his thoughts constantly replaying Emily's words, the fear she must have felt. He found himself growing more isolated, retreating from the world. His phone buzzed often with missed calls from his best friend, Jessica Miller, who had been trying to reach out, worried about his state of mind. But Michael couldn't bring himself to answer. He didn't want to talk, didn't want to explain. He only wanted to keep reading. The more entries he uncovered, the more convinced he became that this was no ordinary tragedy. His sister had uncovered something tied to the woods, to their family, to the very house they lived in. There were nights when Michael thought he heard something, a creak on the stairs or a soft rustling outside his window. He'd lie in bed, straining to listen, the silence of the house pressing in on him. Sometimes when he closed his eyes, he could almost hear whispers, faint and unintelligible, but persistent. One night, unable to sleep, he opened the diary once more and flipped to an entry he hadn't read before. Emily had drawn a detailed map, a rough sketch of their house and the woods behind it. She'd marked the clearings she'd visited and drawn strange symbols in the margins. Symbols that looked like they belonged in some ancient book, their meaning indecipherable. Beneath the map, she had written one word: help. That was when Michael realized he couldn't stop at reading. He had to go to the clearing himself. He had to understand what had led his sister there, what had terrified her so deeply. Maybe then he could find some way to make sense of her death. Maybe then he could bring some peace to himself and to her memory. The attic had grown colder again, and Michael swore he felt a chill breeze sweep through, even though the windows were closed. He shivered, his eyes catching on a shadow in the corner. He blinked and it was gone, but the feeling lingered, that cold presence that Emily had described so vividly. Michael wondered if he too was now being watched, if whatever had taken Emily had turned its attention to him. And still, he couldn't stop reading. The wind howled outside, rattling the old house's windows as Michael stayed hunched over the diary, flipping through the pages in a mix of obsession and despair. He couldn't shake the sense of urgency that had settled deep in his bones. He had started to feel like he was living in Emily's shadow, seeing the world through her terrified eyes. And then, as the days blurred together, the strange occurrences began. It started with small, almost dismissible things. Objects weren't quite where he remembered putting them. His car keys moved from the kitchen counter to the hallway table, lights flickering at random. He tried to ignore it at first, writing it off as exhaustion. He wasn't sleeping well after all, but there was something about the quiet rustle of the curtains when the windows were closed, the way the air turned cold without explanation, that started to gnaw at him. One night, as Michael sat on the couch flipping through the television channels without any real interest, he heard a sound, a soft, barely perceptible scratching. He paused, holding his breath, his eyes darting toward the hallway. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to come from the attic, the very place where he'd found Emily's diary. His heart pounded in his chest as he stood up, creeping slowly towards the source of the noise. The attic door loomed above, and as he reached for the pull cord, he could feel the chill emanating from behind it. With a deep breath, Michael pulled the hatch open, the old wood groaning. The steps slid down with a jarring thud. He stood there, staring up into the darkness, the scratching having suddenly ceased. The silence was worse, somehow, thick and heavy, pressing down on him. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, paralyzed by a fear he couldn't fully rationalize. Finally, he backed away, shutting the door, the feeling of unease lingering long after. The next morning, he awoke to find a picture frame knocked over, the glass shattered. It was one of the family photos, the four of them taken at a summer fair when Emily was about 12. Her face, specifically, had a long crack running through it, as if something had deliberately marred her image. He picked up the pieces, his hands shaking, a sense of dread gnawing at the edges of his mind. He couldn't help but feel it was a warning, though he tried, desperately, to ignore that thought. Things escalated quickly after that. The whispers started, soft, unintelligible, just on the edge of hearing. At first, he thought it was the wind, but the sound grew more distinct, like voices speaking from just beyond the walls. He'd catch glimpses of shadows moving in his peripheral vision, fleeting shapes that disappeared when he turned his head. One night he woke up with a start, his heart pounding, and he was certain he saw a dark figure standing at the foot of his bed. He blinked, and it was gone, but the feeling of being watched lingered, a heavy presence that pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. Michael found himself increasingly isolated. He ignored the calls from Jessica, his best friend, her voice on the answering machine filled with concern. "Mike, I don't know what's going on, but I'm worried. Please call me back." He knew she meant well, but how could he explain what he was experiencing without sounding insane? The diary had become his lifeline, the only thing that seemed to make sense in a world that was unraveling. He flipped through the pages, finding an entry Emily had written just a few weeks before her death. Her handwriting was shaky, the lines uneven, as if she'd written it in a hurry. March 25th. It's inside the house now. I can hear it moving around at night. I think it wants me to understand something, but I don't know what. I'm scared to sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I feel it standing there, watching. I think it's getting stronger. Michael's stomach twisted as he read the words. He couldn't help but feel that whatever had haunted his sister had not left. It was still here, and now it was fixating on him. He needed to understand why. He needed to know what Emily had found, what secrets she had uncovered that led to all of this. He had to go to the clearing she'd mentioned in the woods. Maybe there he could find some answers, or at the very least, a way to stop whatever was happening. The house was changing around him, becoming something darker, something that felt like it was actively trying to keep him on edge. It was no longer the home of his childhood. It had transformed into something twisted, a place where the past and the present blurred together in a nightmarish blend. The walls seemed to whisper at night, and the windows would rattle as if something outside was demanding to be let in. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, feeling the gaze of an unseen presence on him. The connection between the diary and his current reality was undeniable. The experiences Emily had described were happening to him now, almost as if he was retracing her steps, inching closer to whatever fate had befallen her. He knew he couldn't let it end the same way for him. He had to break the cycle, whatever it was. Michael looked at the diary, the pages creased and smudged from his constant handling. He knew what he had to do next. He had to face the clearing in the woods, confront whatever had drawn Emily there in the first place. He couldn't let this thing, whatever it was, win. As he made his way towards the back door, the house seemed to groan, almost as if in protest. The cold air from the attic seemed to follow him down the stairs, a chill that seeped into his bones. Michael stepped outside, his eyes on the dark line of trees at the edge of the yard, the woods looming ahead like a boundary he was both terrified of and drawn to. He took a deep breath and started walking, the diary held tightly in his hand, the pages rustling as if whispering secrets only he could hear. The air grew colder as Michael made his way into the woods. The diary clutched like a talisman against whatever horrors lay ahead. The trees stood tall and bare, their skeletal branches casting twisted shadows that seemed to reach for him. Michael's breath clouded in the frigid night, the crunch of leaves underfoot, his only companion as he followed Emily's hand-drawn map deeper into the dark. The clearing wasn't far. He knew this stretch of forest well enough. He and Emily had played there as kids, building forts and imagining adventures. Now, the forest felt hostile, the rustling of leaves a reminder that he was no longer alone. He arrived at the clearing, and there it was, a ring of trees, their trunks covered in strange, deep carvings that twisted and curled into symbols that Michael didn't recognize. He traced one with his fingers, the lines rough under his skin, feeling the chill seep through him as though the tree itself held some dark secret. At the center of the clearing lay a circle of stones, their surfaces etched with the same symbols. The ground inside the circle was bare, scorched as if something had burned there recently. Michael's heart thudded in his chest as he knelt, examining the markings, his fingers brushing over the ash. He flipped open the diary to one of Emily's later entries, a frantic sketch of the stones, the same symbols he now saw in front of him, drawn in quick, heavy strokes. March 28th. They told me, I know now why they watch. It's not just me, it's our family. We're part of something old, something that never left this place. I wish I could forget what I learned. I wish I hadn't found the book in the attic, but it's too late. They're coming. Michael's stomach turned as he read those words. He leaned back, his eyes scanning the clearing, as a deep unease settled in his gut. This was more than just some ghostly presence or a trick of the mind. Emily had found something about their family history, something that tied them to this place. He remembered the odd stories his grandmother had told when he was a child. Stories about strange events, unexplainable tragedies that had happened to their ancestors. Stories he had brushed off as superstitions. Now they all seemed to echo back, each one a fragment of a truth he was only beginning to comprehend. Michael's gaze drifted across the clearing, and that was when he noticed it. At the base of one of the larger trees was a mound of disturbed earth. He moved closer, the realization dawning slowly, like a chill creeping up his spine. He fell to his knees, pushing at the dirt, his hands trembling. Underneath, he found an old box, its edges splintered, the wood stained dark with age. The lid creaked as he pried it open, revealing a collection of items: yellowed papers, small trinkets, and something wrapped in fabric. Unfolding the cloth, Michael found an old book, the leather cracked and worn, its pages filled with similar symbols to the ones carved into the trees. This was the book Emily had mentioned. He flipped through it, the words written in a language he couldn't understand. There were drawings, sketches of people who bore an eerie resemblance to his ancestors, figures standing before dark shapes, their faces twisted in terror. One sketch caught his eye. It showed a figure alone, standing inside a ring of stones just like the one in the clearing, surrounded by shadowy entities. Suddenly, everything started to make sense in a way that filled Michael with an all-consuming dread. This wasn't just a haunting, it was a curse, something tied to his family, something that had been passed down through generations. Each generation had been marked, watched, eventually claimed by whatever this presence was. It wasn't Emily's imagination, nor was it just a coincidence that strange tragedies seemed to plague their lineage. They were part of a cycle, bound by something their ancestors had done long ago, something that had never been put to rest. The diary's last entry, dated the day before Emily died, fell open, and Michael read her final words. March 30th. I tried to run, but it doesn't matter. It won't let me go. I saw them last night, in my room. They whispered the truth to me. We can't escape it, Michael. I wish I could tell you more, but if you're reading this, please be careful. It's stronger now. It wants one of us. I think it's me, but if it's not, don't let it take you too. Michael's vision blurred as tears filled his eyes. He could feel her fear, the hopelessness she must have felt knowing she was next, that no matter what she did, she couldn't escape. And now it was him. He had taken up the diary, followed in her footsteps, and now it was his turn. The air grew colder still, and Michael could hear it. Soft whispers, almost inaudible, coming from the shadows of the trees. He turned, his breath caught in his throat as he saw them. Dark shapes, figures standing just at the edge of the clearing, watching him. The same shapes that Emily had seen, the same presence that had haunted her. He realized then that his obsession with the diary, his determination to understand, had led him to this point. He was part of the cycle, and whatever malevolent force had claimed Emily was now turning its attention to him. His chest tightened with fear, but beneath the fear, there was also a determination. He couldn't let it end like this. He had to find a way to break the cycle, to put an end to whatever curse had bound his family for generations. Michael clutched the book, his gaze darting to the symbols carved into the trees, and a thought formed in his mind, a desperate plan. Emily had written about them watching, about something that needed to be understood. He would have to face whatever this was, confront it directly, and somehow find a way to sever the connection that had haunted his family for so long. He looked down at the diary, his sister's last words etched into his mind. He could feel her presence, as if she were standing right beside him, urging him forward. He wasn't just doing this for himself, he was doing it for Emily, to give her the peace she deserved. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows seemed to inch closer, the air thick with a dark, oppressive energy. Michael knew there was no turning back now. He had to confront this head-on, whatever it took, before it claimed him too. Michael's breath came in shallow gasps as he stood in the center of the clearing, the chill from the earth seeping into his bones. The dark figures at the edge of the woods watched him, shifting subtly as though drawn closer by his fear. He clutched Emily's diary in one hand and the old book he'd found in the other, his mind racing with fragmented memories of his sister's words, her drawings, and the symbols she had left behind. He had to act now, or whatever haunted his family would claim him just like it had taken Emily. The realization left him trembling, but in the midst of his terror, there was also a flicker of determination. He flipped through the ancient book, finding the pages with the symbols that matched those in the clearing. There were instructions, cryptic phrases, ritualistic drawings, things he didn't fully understand but had no choice but to follow. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, carrying with it the whispers that had begun to echo louder. more distinct. Michael knelt by the circle of stones, using a stick to retrace the symbols on the ground, the strange markings that Emily had drawn over and over in the diary. He remembered her words, "It's getting stronger." He couldn't help but feel the truth of that now. This presence was growing, feeding off his fear and despair. As he worked, he thought of Emily, her face smiling back at him from the old family photographs, her laughter echoing in his memory. She had faced this alone, terrified and abandoned. Michael gritted his teeth. He wasn't going to let her down now. He wasn't going to let her death be in vain. He arranged the stones into their original positions and with trembling hands opened the old book to a page filled with words that looked almost like chants. The language was foreign, but somehow familiar, as if he'd heard it whispered in his dreams. Michael closed his eyes and began to recite the words, his voice shaky at first, barely rising above a whisper. The air around him grew colder still, and the shadows seemed to close in, their forms darkening, becoming more solid, more real. The symbols on the ground began to glow faintly, a pale blue light emanating from the earth as Michael's voice grew louder. The wind swirled, and a low, guttural sound began to emanate from the forest, a sound that sent shivers racing down his spine. He forced himself to keep chanting, focusing on each word, the sound of his own voice, the only thing anchoring him against the overwhelming fear that threatened to consume him. Suddenly a scream pierced the air, high-pitched and anguished. Michael's heart lurched, and he snapped his eyes open. The figures in the woods were moving now, shifting towards him, their forms distorting as they approached. The scream came again, and Michael realized with horror that it was Emily's voice. He could hear her somewhere beyond the shadows, her cries for help echoing in the dark. "Emily!" he shouted, his voice cracking. He spun around, trying to find her, to see her through the darkness, but there was nothing. Only the shadows and the cold, and the feeling of being surrounded by something ancient and malevolent. Michael continued the chant, his voice hoarse, tears streaming down his face. He could feel the presence growing, the pressure building until it felt like his chest would burst. The symbols on the ground flared brighter, and the shadows recoiled slightly, as if repelled by the light. Michael gripped the book tighter, his knuckles white, his voice rising in desperation. The shadows, however, were relentless. They circled him, their forms twisting and warping, and Michael could see them now, faces hidden in the darkness, eyes that glowed faintly, mouths that whispered his name. He felt the ground beneath him shudder, the stones vibrating as the air filled with a deep, resonant hum. The old book began to grow warm in his hands, almost too hot to touch, and Michael's chanting grew more fervent. The wind whipped at him, pulling at his clothes, the whispers now a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from all directions. He could hear Emily's voice among them, pleading, terrified, calling out to him. The glow from the symbols spread, bathing the entire clearing in an eerie blue light, and for a moment Michael thought he saw Emily standing at the edge of the clearing, her form faint, her eyes wide with fear. She looked at him, her lips moving as if to speak, but no sound came out. He reached towards her, his heart aching. "Emily!" he called out, his voice breaking. In that instant, the light surged, a blinding flash that forced Michael to shield his eyes. The wind howled, and he could hear the shadows screaming, angry, desperate cries that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the night. The air was filled with a deafening roar, and Michael fell to his knees, his voice lost amidst the chaos. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The wind died down, the light faded, and the clearing fell into an eerie silence. Michael opened his eyes, blinking against the darkness. The shadows were gone, the stones lying still on the ground, the symbols now nothing more than faint impressions in the earth. He looked around, his heart pounding, his breath coming in ragged gasps. There was no sign of Emily. The clearing was empty, the woods around him silent. Michael felt a crushing weight in his chest, the realization that whatever had happened, it hadn't brought her back. But something had changed. The presence, the COULDN, oppressive force that had haunted him for weeks, it was gone. The air felt lighter, the sense of dread that had hung over him now lifted, leaving behind only an aching emptiness. Michael collapsed onto the ground, the old book slipping from his grasp. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He had done it. He had broken the connection. severed whatever curse had bound his family. But it had come at a cost. Emily was gone, truly gone, and no ritual could bring her back. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, Michael rose shakily to his feet, his body aching, exhaustion pressing heavily on him. He looked down at the diary, at the pages filled with Emily's words, her fear, her hope that somehow someone would understand. He picked it up, holding it close to his chest, a silent promise that he wouldn't let her memory fade. With slow, weary steps, Michael left the clearing, the woods now quiet, the air still. He made his way back to the house, the old book abandoned behind him, the clearing once again falling into silence. The darkness had been lifted, but the emptiness remained, a hollow ache that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The Thompson family house was a hollow, silent monument to the lives it had witnessed and the tragedies it had endured. As Michael walked back inside, the dawn light barely penetrated the curtains, casting long shadows across the floor. The house felt different now, less oppressive, less heavy, as if something dark and malignant had finally released its grip. But in the newfound stillness, there was an undeniable emptiness, a void where his sister's laughter, her presence, used to be. Michael slumped it into a chair at the kitchen table, the same place where he'd sat days ago reading Emily's diary for the first time. He set the diary down, running his fingers across the cover, the pages now worn and creased from his obsessive reading. He felt like he had aged years in just days. His eyes stung, his throat raw from shouting in the clearing. He was exhausted physically and emotionally, but there was a sense of relief mixed with the sadness that now consumed him. He thought of Emily, her laughter as a child, the way she used to pester him to play board games or tell her bedtime stories. He thought about her last weeks, the fear, the confusion, her desperate search for answers. Michael understood now what she had gone through, the terror she must have faced alone. He had done everything he could to stop it, but the cost had been high. He had freed her from whatever dark grip had claimed her, but it didn't make the loss any easier to bear. Karen and Robert Thompson had barely been present these past few months, each of them dealing with grief in their own way, shutting themselves off from the world. Michael knew they would struggle to understand what had happened. How could he even begin to explain the curse, the ritual, the darkness that had haunted their family for generations? But even if they didn't understand, he hoped that they too might find some measure of peace now that the oppressive presence had lifted. Michael wandered through the house, the familiar rooms now tinged with an odd sense of nostalgia. He stopped outside Emily's bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, her belongings untouched since her death. He pushed the door open gently, the soft creak echoing in the quiet. Her room was just as she had left it, her bed neatly made, her posters on the walls. He stepped inside, his gaze lingering on the small details, her favorite stuffed bear on the pillow, the collection of books stacked haphazardly on her desk. He sat down on her bed, feeling the weight of the past few days pressed down on him. It was over now, whatever had haunted them, but Michael couldn't shake the sense of profound loss. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Emily's diary. He opened it, flipping to one of the earlier entries, back when she was still herself, before the darkness had started creeping in. January 15. Today was a good day. Michael took me to the movies and we ate way too much popcorn. I wish every day could be like this. I feel safe when he's around, like everything will be okay. Michael closed the diary, a lump forming in his throat. He wished he could have been there for her, really been there, when she needed him most. But even now, even in the wake of everything, he took some comfort in knowing that at least he had tried. He had faced the darkness for her, had fought to give her the peace she deserved. It wasn't enough to bring her back, but it was something. He stood up, placing the diary on her desk next to the stack of books. It belonged here with her, not buried away in some attic where no one would find it. He took one last look around the room, then turned and walked out, leaving the door open. The house was eerily quiet now, but it was a different kind of silence. No longer oppressive, no longer full of whispers and shadows. It was just empty. The weight of grief still hung in the air, but the feeling of an unwelcome presence had gone. The house had been cleansed, but at a price that Michael wasn't sure he could ever truly come to terms with. As the morning sun began to filter through the windows, Michael made his way back downstairs. He needed to rest, to sleep, to allow himself the space to feel the exhaustion that had settled deep into his bones. He collapsed onto the couch, the events of the past few days swirling in his mind, a confusing blend of terror and sadness. He closed his eyes, the weight of sleep pulling him under almost instantly. For the first time since Emily's death, there were no nightmares, no shadows lurking at the edges of his vision, no whispers calling his name, only a quiet, dreamless sleep, a small mercy amidst the grief. Aftermath. The Thompson family tried to move on in the weeks that followed. Michael spoke little of what had happened, knowing it would be impossible for his parents to believe, let alone understand. He told them what they needed to hear, that Emily was at peace now, that they didn't have to be afraid anymore. He saw a change in his mother, Karen, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She started spending less time in Emily's room, slowly returning to the present, to life. His father, Robert, seemed to soften, spending more time at home, trying to rebuild the fragile connections that had frayed since Emily's death. Michael himself was haunted by the memories, images of the dark shapes in the woods, the oppressive whispers that had once filled the house. But there was also a sense of closure. He had faced the darkness and had survived. He had done what Emily couldn't, and though it hurt, he took some solace in knowing that he had ended the cycle, that he had freed them from the curse that had haunted their family for generations. Final twist, one quiet evening, as Michael sat in the kitchen staring absently out the window, he heard a noise, a faint thud, almost imperceptible. He turned, his gaze falling on the hallway, his heart skipping a beat. Slowly he rose to his feet, his eyes narrowing. There, on the table, was a small, familiar object, a diary, bound with a red ribbon. Michael's blood ran cold as he stepped closer, the air suddenly heavy once more, a chill settling in his bones. He reached out, his hand trembling as he untied the ribbon. He flipped open the cover, his breath catching in his throat. The first page was blank, but at the very bottom, in small, shaky writing, was a single sentence. "It's not over." Michael felt a shiver run down his spine, the shadows in the house seeming to grow longer as the last light of day faded. The story of Michael and Emily is rooted deeply in the emotions of grief, regret, and the inescapable ties of family, elements that resonate powerfully in the aftermath of what they've endured. As the supernatural elements slowly unfold and are revealed, they intertwine with these very human experiences, making the horror deeply personal and tragically inevitable. This act explores how those emotions and themes are central to the story's unsettling impact, making it a horror tale not only about a dark entity, but also about the weight of familial love and loss. Grief plays a central role, shaping every action that Michael takes. His return to his childhood home is colored by the profound sense of loss, the emptiness of a house that used to be full of life. The death of Emily, his younger sister, is a blow that reverberates not just through Michael, but through his entire family. His mother, Karen, retreats into a shell, spending her days in Emily's room, unable to move on, while his father, Robert, buries himself in work, emotionally distant. The grief is almost a physical entity in the house, filling every corner, touching every memory. For Michael, his regret is palpable. He looks back at all the signs he missed, Emily's fear, her strange behavior, the way she had seemed to drift away from the family in her final weeks. His need to understand, to find the truth behind her death, is driven by the guilt of not being there when she needed him. He wasn't just trying to solve a mystery, he was trying to atone for his absence, for the moments he hadn't taken her fear seriously. His obsession with her diary, his determination to follow the clues she left behind, was as much about reconnecting with her as it was about finding answers. The bond between siblings is a crucial part of this emotional core. Michael and Emily were 12 years apart, yet they had been close. She was his little sister, someone he felt protective over, someone who looked up to him as her hero. Their bond, fractured by her untimely death, is the driving force behind Michael's actions throughout the story. He cannot let go of her memory, and in a way, reading her diary is like having one last conversation with her. He feels her presence in her words, feels her fear, her hope that maybe he would be the one to save her. It's this bond that ultimately pushes Michael to face the darkness head-on, to break the curse that has claimed his family. The past and its inescapable nature is another theme that casts a long shadow over the story. The discovery of the family's dark history, of an ancient curse tied to their lineage, is something that changes everything Michael thought he knew about his family. The idea that they were bound to a cycle of tragedy and haunting speaks to a fear that runs deep. No matter how far we try to distance ourselves from the past, it finds a way to catch up. Michael's realization that Emily's death was not just an accident, but part of something much larger, something deeply rooted in their family's history, creates a chilling layer to the horror. It's not just about ghosts or entities. It's about the sins of the past coming back to claim the present. The thin veil between reality and the supernatural is explored through Michael's growing obsession with the diary. At first, he thinks of Emily's fears as irrational, something imagined by a teenage mind under stress. But as he begins to experience the strange occurrences himself, the whispers, the shadows, the cold presence that fills the house, the line between reality and the supernatural begins to blur. Michael's descent into the diary's secrets, his belief in the curse, isolates him from those around him. He pushes away Jessica, his best friend, and even his parents. His journey is one of lonely desperation, a slow realization that the things Emily wrote about were not just figments of her imagination, but a chilling reality. The resolution of Michael's story, with the ritual in the woods and his confrontation with the supernatural forces, carries a theme of sacrifice. He is willing to put himself in harm's way to save his sister, to break the cycle that has claimed her. Yet, even in his success, there is no true victory. He has freed the house from its dark presence, has broken the immediate threat, but the cost has been high. He couldn't save Emily, couldn't bring her back. The supernatural battle may be over, but the emotional scars remain. This leads into the final lingering theme of uncertainty and cyclical fear. The closing twist with the reappearance of a new diary bound with a red ribbon underscores that the story isn't truly over. The family curse may be deeper and more powerful than Michael could comprehend. Despite all he has done, the sense of inescapability remains. The cycle may not be entirely broken, and the fear lingers, a reminder that sometimes what haunts us cannot be easily put to rest. By focusing on the real raw emotions of grief, guilt, and familial love, the horror in Michael and Emily's story becomes deeply relatable. Readers connect to Michael's fear not only because of the supernatural elements, but because of the very human experiences that drive him, his love for his sister, his desperation to protect her, and his need to make things right. The emotional resonance makes the horror all the more powerful because it's grounded in something we all understand: loss, regret, and the hope that somehow we can fight the darkness, even when it seems impossible. The realistic emotional core of the story makes the supernatural elements all the more terrifying. The gradual buildup of tension, the slow unraveling of Emily's diary, the strange occurrences in the house, the isolation Michael feels, all create an atmosphere that blurs the line between psychological and supernatural horror. By focusing on the emotional journey of the characters, the horror becomes an extension of their internal struggles, turning their own fears and regrets into something tangible and terrifying. Michael had been sleeping on the couch for days, unwilling to go upstairs, unwilling to step back into the shadows of the house that now felt more like a stranger than the place he'd once called home. Though the supernatural presence that had haunted him seemed to have vanished, a strange heaviness lingered, a sense that something was watching, waiting. He woke one night to a soft rustling, the kind of sound that would be easy to ignore, but in the quiet of the house, it seemed to echo. Michael sat up, his body tensing. He listened carefully, his breath caught in his throat. The noise seemed to be coming from the hallway, a shuffling sound like the scrape of paper against wood. He hesitated, a knot tightening in his stomach. Slowly he stood, his bare feet silent on the cool floor. He moved cautiously toward the hallway, the shadows elongating as the moonlight filtered through the windows. His pulse quickened with every step, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. The noise grew louder, the rustling turning into the soft turning of pages. Michael stopped, his eyes widening as he reached the kitchen. There, on the table, lay a new diary, bound in leather and tied with a red ribbon, its pages flipping by themselves as if caught in a breeze that Michael could not feel. His heart sank. He approached the table, the sound of the pages flipping filling the silence. A whisper of movement in the stillness of the house. The red ribbon lay loose, as if it had been untied by invisible hands. Michael swallowed hard, reaching out with trembling fingers. The pages stopped flipping. Michael hesitated before leaning over, his eyes scanning the words written on the open page. His blood ran cold. It was Emily's handwriting. April 2nd. It's back, Michael. I tried to warn you. I tried to tell you it wasn't over. It wants more, and it won't stop until it gets what it came for. Michael's chest tightened, a cold shiver running through him. His eyes flickered across the page, the words almost blurring in his vision. His fingers tightened on the edges of the book, his knuckles white. Suddenly the temperature dropped, the air around him turning frigid, his breath visible in the cold. He heard it then, a faint whisper coming from behind him, a voice that was low and almost playful. It spoke his name, slow and deliberate. Michael. He spun around, his eyes darting through the darkness, his heart pounding, adrenaline coursing through his veins. The shadows seemed to shift, to move closer, creeping along the walls. He felt the familiar weight of dread settle over him, a crushing realization that all he had fought for, all he had risked, might have been in vain. He looked back at the diary, the page now filled with new words, written in a frantic scrawl that hadn't been there moments before. He leaned over, squinting in the dim light. It's not just the past, Michael. It's the future. It knows you. It knows what you fear. The whispers grew louder, coming from all directions now, echoing through the empty house. A chorus of voices that seemed to close in on him, each one more desperate than the last. Michael backed away, his eyes darting across the room, the shadows twisting into familiar shapes. Figures that stood at the edge of his vision, their presence an echo of what he'd faced in the clearing. He grabbed the diary, slamming it shut, the whispers falling silent as he did. The weight of the silence was deafening, pressing in on him. He took a shaky breath, the cold still clinging to him, his body trembling. He knew then that whatever this was, it wasn't over. It had never been over. The curse, the presence, it was part of his family, a shadow that would continue to follow them. No matter what he did, he had tried to break the cycle, but it was like fighting a tide that pulled relentlessly at his feet, dragging him under no matter how hard he tried to fight back. Michael looked at the diary, the red ribbon falling loosely over his hand. He understood now that the darkness wasn't something that could be banished so easily. It was patient, it was relentless, and it would always be there, waiting in the shadows. The house creaked softly, and Michael turned, his eyes catching sight of something moving just at the edge of his vision. A figure, dark and indistinct, lingering in the hallway, watching. He blinked, and it was gone, but the feeling remained, cold, invasive, undeniable. With a shaky breath, Michael tied the ribbon tightly around the diary, his fingers trembling. He knew he had to keep going, to try to protect what was left of his family. But a part of him wondered if it was even possible to win against something that had haunted them for so long. He placed the diary back on the table, turning away, his steps heavy as he walked back to the couch. He lay down, pulling the blanket over himself, his eyes staring into the darkness. Somewhere in the house, a door creaked open, a soft whisper drifting through the air. Michael closed his eyes, his heart pounding, his mind filled with the words that had been scrawled on the last page of the diary. It's not over. And in the silence that followed, Michael knew one thing with chilling certainty. This was only the beginning.